Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Performance Mindset Show. I am your host, Amy Calandrino. I'm CEO of Beyond Commercial and also author of the book From Perfect to Real. This show is all about leveling up in business, real estate, leadership, and life by shifting how you think, grow, and lead. So each week, I'll bring to you real conversations with top performers and mindset experts who are building big lives on their own terms. So if you're ready to ditch perfection, trust your path, and grow with intention, you're in the right place. While you're at it, be sure to subscribe so you can get the latest episodes, and let's get into it. Today, I have with me Tommy Brachey, and we actually met through Twitter. Yeah. And he is in real estate doing 1031s, mineral rights. He does a lot of networking, all kinds of things. So I'm going to let him talk to you about what he does, how he got into it, and then we are going to get into all those things.
Certainly. No, thanks for having me on here. Yeah, that's true. We met on X or Twitter, whatever we want to call it these days. It's got a very, very neat niche from a commercial real estate perspective. So I'm glad that we had the opportunity to connect on there and then subsequently here. But yeah, my name is Tommy Brachey. I operate in kind of the niche subset of the real estate market, being mineral rights or deeded mineral properties. I don't think anybody plans on entering this space. At least very few do. I get asked all the time how I got into this space. I usually make a joke about a plinko board, if you know what that is, with the pegs, and you drop the ball and it just, wherever it lands, it lands. You can have as much strategy as you want, but you can't always predict where that's going to go. That's kind of how I ended up here. The kind of abridged version of that is, I have a real estate and finance background. Had about 7.5 years in the real estate finance space. Kind of previously was at a larger mortgage company. They've since done a few rebrandings, but the long story short is I went from being an operations manager to the axe man, and that really wasn't what I signed up for. Laying people off isn't fun, especially when it's not performance based. When it's just a business decision, it's really a hard thing to do to undeserving individuals. So, when that was going on, this might sound a little fancier than it should or needs to, but I befriended a geophysicist just kind of through friends of a friend. That's been about 10, 12 years ago at this point. But yeah, it's not the stereotype you would think. Just you'd never know this guy's a scientist from the surface level.
Well, sometimes people really seem like scientific. It's really blatantly obvious.
Yes.
And then sometimes not so much. You're like, oh, you're like a cool scientist.
Like, interesting. You're kind of against the grain. It's like the extroverted accountant. They exist, but you're not going to find them very often, right? And that might be the case here too. But to fast forward through all of that, over time, the conversation just led one thing to another, where it's how do I bring my real estate knowledge, my real estate network, the networking events that I put on, which I can mention briefly, to your world in the mineral rights space. So that's kind of where we paired up, I put on now 1031 exchange education events and classes with kind of mineral rights and mineral deeds in mind. A lot of people don't know what a 1031 is, but even those that do know, they typically aren't that familiar with mineral rights and the fact that deeded mineral properties are 1031 exchange compatible. So I kind of tailor my seminars depending on my audience for that. But that's kind of the shortened version, if you will, of how I got into the space. Real estate background, befriend somebody in the mineral rights and oil and gas space. And now here we are. I'm kind of a fusion of the two.
Well, it's kind of crazy. So we chat on Twitter frequently with a bunch of commercial real estate nerds. And I remember specifically Aaron of Dutch Brothers, and he's a real estate nerd, and all these other people are real estate. I consider myself a real estate nerd. I have a lot of letters behind my name, and I didn't know what this was. And I was like, if these people do not know what it is, I would have to assume the general public doesn't know what it is. And by the way, we should take a picture for Aaron.
Let's do that.
Very proud of us. Boop, boop, boop. Okay. I figured if he didn't know about it and all of us didn't know what we said, let's have a space. And for those listening to the show, again, it's all about leveling up in business and in life. And, I really want to spur, at least, especially with my clients, I want to have people not only attain investor class, but to really thrive. And so, looking at all the tools that we can deploy is amazing. So let's start with a primer. For those that don't know what a 1031 is, what are they basically, and how do they work, and why are they so important for people looking to defer property taxes on their sales?
Yeah. This will be a very high level view of it.
Yeah.
I could spend an hour or 2 hours even talking about 1031 exchanges and just their mechanics. But at the 30,000 foot level, so to speak, essentially when you have an investment property, whether that be a rental house or a commercial building of some kind, generally speaking, those are 1031 compatible. When you sell that property, or when the time comes for you to do so, you're likely going to be exposed to some steep capital gains taxes on the profit, depending on your basis in that property.
Yeah.
And what the 1031 exchange allows you to do is use section 1031 of the tax code to defer your capital gains, as long as you roll those gains into your next replacement property that needs to also obviously be 1031 exchange compatible. You can do a partial exchange, or you can come out of pocket on top of it too. So there is some flexibility there. But essentially, it's not tax free; it's tax deferral, right? In theory, you're going to have to pay that tax at a future date. Now, without getting into the weeds, there are estate planning tactics called swap till you drop, where you just defer and defer and defer and defer until the time comes when you're passing your assets on to your heirs. They then get a step up in basis. So there are some methodologies that can be used to punt that tax bill, so to speak, in an advantageous manner. But without getting into the weeds, that's at a high level what a 1031 does and how it's useful.
Well, I think at its core, any high net worth individual or someone that's starting to make headways that way, or is a business owner or investor, they could benefit from having a really good attorney as part of their. And sometimes it's not only just like your real estate business attorney, but then also having an estate planning attorney that's helping you to prepare for those things. And then, of course, on your team, you're going to have your banker, you're going to have your CPA, and all these kinds of things, because necessarily accumulating wealth and taxes, they're in conflict with each other all the time. And so you got to have all these people around you talking to each other and figuring out what works best for you and your family situation.
Yeah, it takes a professional village, if you will. And that actually leads to a great point. Just your typical disclaimers. This isn't financial advice.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say that. Yeah, please note the content discussed on this show is for informational purposes only, should not be construed as financial, investment, or legal advice. I was going to say that at the beginning. No. Thank you.
Yeah, teamwork. See,
teamwork.
That's why we have the teams. But no, you're absolutely right. It's you'll want a 1031 qualified intermediary in your corner, and that term can be applied relatively broadly. But there are people dedicated to that role that work for specific 1031 qualified intermediary companies, or 1031 exchange companies, I should say. But that role can be applied with a slightly broader brush. But I encourage anyone doing a 1031 exchange to have someone in their corner that does that full time. It just kind of covers your bases, for lack of a better phrasing.
Yeah. Now, I've read some books about 1031s. I've taken all day classes on 1031s, and frankly, unless you are really into this stuff, it's a snooze fest. And so better off to utilize professionals to help you cut through what's specific to your situation, instead of having to mull through all this information that's not applicable to your situation.
Exactly. I put on 1031 exchange seminars all the time, usually in person. I'll probably ramp up the online presence for it a little bit, but in my niche, and we can dig into this a little bit more, but in my niche, people aren't Googling what I do, right? So I have to get in front of people. Right. So that's why I prefer the in-person. It suits my personality type in the first place. So there is a convenience and a little bit of a personal bias there. But essentially, no one's Googling mineral deeds, 1031 exchange, tax deferral, cash flow. No one's Googling that, right?
No.
So, when I'm putting on the 1031 classes, I typically target, brokers and realtors and agents, from commercial and residential. Usually, it's the more higher net worth individuals on the residential side, but not all, not exclusively. But and business brokers attend as well. But essentially, it's hard to keep it interesting enough because, like you mentioned, it's a snoozer. I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about deferring taxes, right? It's hard to make that, for lack of better phrasing, it's hard to make that sexy, right? But at these classes, I tend to emphasize, like, if you're a broker or a realtor, it's like this you can really help your clients out with this, even if you don't go through me for my mineral properties or what have you. This is education that every broker and agent really should have at least an intermediate level of knowledge about before they hand it off.
Yeah. Well, I think in your experience, like, what are some of the pitfalls or mistakes that investors make when utilizing 1031 exchanges, and how can they avoid them?
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, without getting into mineral properties specifically, but general 1031s, if you've the seasoned folks in 1031 exchanges are already looking for their replacement properties before they even initiate the 1031 exchange.
Right.
So what I'm getting at there is there's a 45-day identification period that starts as soon as your relinquished property, the property you're selling, closes. There's very few exceptions around that 45-day identification period. I mean, if it lands on Christmas, it lands on Christmas. And if no one's there to facilitate your property identification Christmas Day, IRS says too bad. I mean, but I did mention there are some, and if it lands on a Sunday, same story, right? Now, there are some exceptions, FEMA declared natural disasters and some other, it essentially requires a federal government intervention for you to get an extension. COVID was one of the, kind of black swan events, if you will, that there were exceptions made. But generally speaking, start your research before your clock starts. You have 45 days, like I mentioned, for the identification period. But some people, usually people in their first exchange, and I see this more on the residential side, is they think you also have a 180-day window to close on your replacement property. The uneducated or the newbies in the space, they don't know that that's two separate timers, or they overlap, is what I'm trying to say. They think that 180 days starts at the end of your 45-day identification period.
Right.
Oh, no. So you have two clocks that start at the same time, that 45-day identification period and that 180-day period for your exchange as a whole to close on your replacement property or multiple properties. If you break either of those timelines, you're subjected to pay the capital gains tax. No ifs, ands, or buts for the most part there. And then if you don't accidentally break the rule and then just ask for forgiveness later, because the IRS does not play around with that. You'll get hit with that plus some very steep penalties. So don't play that game is what I'm saying. The other misconception or the other pitfall is people think like kind, because in a 1031 exchange, you have to exchange for what's called a like kind property. Right. And, common sense might tell you that has to be a rental house for a rental house. That has to be an office building for an office building, or raw land for raw land. And that's just not the reality. That's not the case. The way the Internal Revenue Code sees it is like kind is essentially, deeded real property for deeded real property.
Right.
And that's actually where I kind of fit in.
Right.
So deeded mineral properties, as is suggested in the term, it's deeded real estate. It's just not your common sense type of real estate. If you were to walk up to a stranger and say that you're in the real estate, domain, they're not going to. Mineral rights probably isn't crossing any of their minds, even though it technically is by definition. So with that being said, you can 1031 exchange raw land into an office building, from an office building into a rental home, or from a rental home into mineral rights, or from mineral rights back into any of those other asset classes. So that's kind of a misconception, maybe less of a pitfall, but it can serve as a pitfall in the sense that you're looking down a narrower scope than what's required. So you're not really evaluating all of your options. So don't do that to yourself.
I've had people too think like, oh, I'm selling office. I got to buy office, and I'm selling,
Right.
It's like, no, not necessarily. And I think another mistake that people make is do not touch the money. Like,
yes, I'm glad you said that.
Like it's like a hot potato. You do not want to touch it. Like, I think I've heard horror stories where people thought, oh, I can just like decide to do this thereafter and then give the
Oh,
money to the exchange person. You could not touch the money.
yeah,
So
they call that constructive receipt. You cannot take constructive receipt of the funds. And I've heard a horror story. I'm glad it wasn't my client, but I've heard a horror story of someone say, "Well, I never cashed the check, so I'm fine." It's like, ugh, I understand your logic, but that's just not how it works. You acquired that check. You have taken constructive receipt of the funds. The fact that you didn't cash it, that's anecdotal. It doesn't impact the fact that you've taken constructive receipt.
yeah, it has
So
to go to the intermediary.
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, because otherwise, yeah. And if you haven't, yeah, there's agents that have advised people that, oh, you could just decide thereafter. No, 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 no. You have to
Right.
decide and you have to have this all set up. So let's talk a little bit about mineral rights. So it's a unique
Cool.
asset class. How do they fit into real estate investment strategies? And what should investors know before getting involved in buying or selling mineral rights?
Yeah. So there's some overlap from what I refer to as traditional real estate. Given my niche, I have to delineate the two, right? But I think the first part of your question is kind of just overarching. So essentially, mineral rights, while deeded real estate, have their own nuances, and there are some nuance that vary state to state. Just for context for your listeners here, it's the majority of the portfolio that I interact with is actually in West Texas, in the Permian Basin. Technically, the Permian Basin does extend into southeastern New Mexico. It's pretty rare that I personally have properties in the portfolio there, but just for the context, that's where it is. So for real estate investors that are interested in mineral rights, what's mostly appealing about it is, one, it's a diversification move. Essentially, while you're still in the real estate domain, if you will, technically speaking, you're separated. Your valuations are separate from your traditional real estate markets and from the stock markets as well. So for those interested in expanding their portfolio or diversifying their portfolio, mineral rights tends to kind of perk up their ears, so to speak, because most people don't have exposure to this, at least not in this fashion. The other piece of that puzzle there is there's tax advantages that traditional real estate doesn't get to enjoy that the deeded mineral properties do. Just to give you a couple examples, Texas specific on some of these, but in the state of Texas and a handful of other states, there's no traditional property tax on deeded mineral properties. Now, you will have property tax if you own the surface level land, but again, that kind of goes back into what I've termed as traditional real estate. So if you exclusively own the subsurface, in the state of Texas, and I think West Virginia and a handful of other states, there's no traditional property tax. You do have a nominal ad valorem tax, very small. You got to think these properties in West Texas are, they're essentially in the middle of nowhere unless you're in the oil and gas business, right? So those ad valorem taxes are very, very small. There's also the tax advantages of the royalty checks, which I'll get into a little bit more detail. But essentially, you get, if you have a producer or an operator on your property, think Exxon or Chevron, you get a monthly royalty check, and those checks are actually tax advantaged. You get 15% of it's tax free. It's called the depletion allowance. Okay. It's section IRC 613 and 613A. I had to look that up for a client, then I committed that to memory. So don't mistake me for having all these sections memorized. That's just one I've committed to memory. But essentially that, and you combine it with the tax deferral advantages of a 1031 exchange, it's a massive, massive tax swing in the positive direction for those that are eyeballing something to diversify their traditional real estate portfolio. I think that was a multifaceted question you asked. I'm not sure if I covered all the bases there.
Yeah, I think one other thing that's really interesting, and we were chatting with it specifically on that space, is I sold a property, and then I was doing like a 15% down loan on one property and 15%, property, and then I still had some leftover money, and I decided, fine, I don't have another property to invest in, and let's just say I had 111,000 of 110,000 left.
I got you.
Let's just say that. um, mineral rights can be kind of right sized to this
Yes.
kind of investment. Of course, not going to be advantageous to do like $721, but as long as there's
Sure.
meat on the bone, then it's worthwhile maybe to consider it to augment something you're already doing, especially if you're trying to keep a more diversified lens. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up. This is now getting into the realm of where I provide value to more of the commercial clients, the
Yeah.
commercial brokers and agents there. So just to paraphrase your scenario, I'll use some slightly different numbers, but you have
Yes.
if you have a $10 million exchange in a commercial transaction, you might already have a replacement or property or two that amount for $9.2 million and some change.
Yeah, there we go.
Right. So typically what happens where I provide value for my commercial friends is I never try to talk people out of the replacement properties. And that applies to residential too.
Right.
My conversation goes to what we're talking about here is referred to as the boot money, right? The leftover funds in an exchange
Yep.
that are subjected to capital gains taxes. So in that example we just gave, you would have approximately, call it $799,000 and say 10 cents left over,
Right.
exposed to some steep gains. What I can do in the mineral deed asset class is I can bifurcate an existing property that I have in the portfolio into separate standalone deeds that can be of unequal size.
Right.
So if I have a $4 million property and you have $799,000 and 10 cents left in boot, what I can do is bifurcate my $4 million property into two separate deeds. This deed over here, this new deed, well, they're both new deeds, but this deed over here is now valued at $799,000 and 10 cents in mineral interest on my property. Now you can identify that particular property in your exchange, therefore optimizing your 1031 exchange from a capital gains tax exposure perspective. That can, we could be talking about that in that example, 799-ish thousand. That's great. Round numbers, a third of that was about a third was exposed to capital gains tax. It does vary state to state on scenario to scenario, but generally speaking, that's about right. And then if you go to a larger transaction, if you could be talking about hundreds of thousands of tax deferrals that you might not have known were an option for you or your client. Now, the beauty of it is it's more than just a safety net in that regard, right? We can also, if you identify a larger property and your sale doesn't happen, right? We can act as a safety net in that instance as well.
Oh yeah, to put on the 45 days, like you think you're good, everything's good. Me personally, when I did 1031s, I actually was already under contract on my properties, and I went hard as soon as I sold the first property, and so I was pretty sure. But let me tell you what, I still had anxiety, even
Yep.
though I knew, I'm under contract. These are hard. More likely than not, there's a 99% chance that we're going to close here.
Right.
I still felt like if it didn't close, hey, what am I going to do? That's a great tactic where you're kind of covering all your bases, and then putting it on the 45-day sheet doesn't actually obligate you still to do that. Even if, so it's kind of like you said, a safety net.
Yeah, and that's where my commercial clients find the most value. It's a combination of those two things. We're a safety net should the worst case happen where you're not able to close on one of your other identified properties.
Mm-hmm.
Because in that $10 million example, now you have about approximately $3 million exposed to capital gains tax. And if something goes sideways to where maybe you can even close on the property, but keep in mind your back is against the wall in that 180-day window.
Yeah.
You go to 181st day under most circumstances, you're paying that tax, and you're probably also committed to acquiring that other property. You're going to get hit more than once. So you're playing a dangerous game if you don't have your bases covered. So that's where we kind of offer that value for the commercial folks.
Let's just say hypothetically that someone does put it on their 45-day sheet as a 1031 option, and they're having friction. They're maybe on day 151 or even 159. I'm sure you've had this happen before, and they're starting to run out of runway, and they're about to start careening into the ocean with their airplane, right? So, how much time do you have? How much time do you need how much runway do you need to say, okay, this is going to be what we're going to close for
Yeah.
by day 179 or maybe 177. So we're not like right there.
Sure. So no, you bring up a great point. It happens all the time. I usually make a joke at my seminars, like you're talking about the 180-day clock, but in my seminars, usually make a joke about the 45-day identification period, where I say, please don't come to me on day 44 or 45 on purpose. It happens. It happens all the time, but I can typically help in that scenario same day. But I will say this: it does depend on the transaction size, right? From an identification perspective, typically, generally speaking, just from my business, we have an inventory, a standing inventory of between 5 to 10 plus, give or take, $1 million at a given moment. Now, if you give us a little runway, we can go significantly higher than that. But from
Right.
identification purposes, we have to have that property, right? So don't come to me on day
Oh yeah,
45.
yeah, you do. Yeah, you can't just say, "I'm going to call Tommy."
Uh-huh.
Can't
Yeah,
put just Tommy on the line and he'll figure it
right.
out. Like, yeah, you have to
Exactly.
actually have a specific. Okay, yeah, that makes sense too.
Yeah.
So
And
you
that's
day 30 preferred or something like that.
sure. That
Yeah,
that would be nice. I say nice because it's almost a textbook style fairy tale
that only
because
maybe happens 25% of the time.
that's probably fair. Yeah. But that kind of goes back to the seasoned exchangers, and usually commercial folks are a little more seasoned than the residential in this regard, just because there's more dollars at stake, right?
Yeah.
So usually I have on the commercial side people come to me with larger transactions before that 45-day period even starts, right?
Right.
But that is something that happens. The reality is people will come to me on day 45 in a panic. But that kind of dials back to your question on day, like, call it 175 or what have you, where there's like, I'm uncomfortably close to my 180th day. You still have that property I identified as a safety net. Let's
Right.
go ahead and close. You weren't my first choice. I'm like, no offense taken. Because at the end of the day, this deeded minerals are usually outside of the general wheelhouse of the commercial clients. This is, again, serving as that safety net in the 1031 exchange.
Yeah.
And it's worth exploring, just given the number of dollars that are exposed to those taxes if you don't take advantage of it. So day 175, they're like, hey, I don't think I'm closing on day 180, or I'm cutting it too close for comfort for my team or my investors or whatever the scenario is. We're
Hmm.
going to go with you. I'm like, all right. I can usually get those documents processed in a business day. So you're taken care of there. It's a much more streamlined process in the deeded minerals in Texas anyway than traditional real estate. So it does let us be a little nimble, comparatively speaking.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's great. And I mean, at the end of the day, we talk a lot about in my show, like a performance mindset, growth mindset, all those kinds of things. But let's just be real. Whether you have that growth mindset or not, and those kinds of things, it's still natural human instinct to stick with the status quo. If you've
Yes.
always invested in typical commercial real estate that you could touch, see, drive by and take a picture and send it to your aunt Susan that you
Yes.
just bought this building, you can't take a picture of your
Yeah,
mineral rights
that's
necessarily.
true.
Yeah, like it's just like I have this, like it almost seems like an ethereal thing, and so
Yes.
so that's what But I'm sure as people invest in it more and realize the advantages that it can become, if we're in a weird market as well, where sellers' expectations are not aligning with the buyer's expectations, and you guys are just knocking heads and nobody is giving way. That it might be better maybe to go with something that's not what you normally do,
Right.
that you're at least more likely than not maybe achieve a return on.
That's a great paraphrasing of what I usually the friction that I usually face, if
Yeah.
you will. My job is actually less sales, more education because of
Right.
that fact. I put on, like I've mentioned a couple times, those 1031 seminars. I focus mainly on the 1031s themselves. And then it's like, hey, by the way, this is more than just fun information at a cocktail party. You guys can actually help your clients out and also drive up your volume and in turn your commissions if you're a broker or an agent, that is.
Yeah.
It's there's something to be said for kind of familiarizing yourself at a smaller degree rather than putting a large nest egg into a foreign basket, if you will. And that's true on a commercial side as
Yeah.
well. Sometimes we'll be like comparatively small exchange for a commercial exchange might be $250,000. It's like,
Right.
hey, this was an $80 million exchange. We heard about you guys, and we heard about this option. We're not going to be giving y'all our boot money into this exchange, but we are going to allocate $250,000 as a proof of concept for our underwriters and for our team here for future transactions. We want to see the performance here. We want to see how what the overhead really is actually holding the deed, which, by the way, it's almost zero. But it does require trust and proof of concept.
Like just dipping your toe in the water. Yeah.
I say that exact phrase. You're absolutely right. So that's usually kind of an introductory path, if you will, on the commercial side. Occasionally, if someone's going into a very large amount the first time, it's because their back was against the wall and they had too much exposure. We're happy to help, and those clients are happy, but that's not the norm.
Right. I think you would more want to kind of ease into something new. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Do you have a real world example? And of course, you don't have to give names of where you helped a client navigate a 1031 exchange that involved mineral rights, and what were some of the challenges, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, no, that's a relatively easy one. I've got a couple examples. I'll drill down to one. I think that's probably universally relatable. We actually help out a lot of estate planners. So if you have a 1031 exchange, well, let me take one step back. Not to be morbid, but if you have a relative who's getting up in age, and they're having an estate planning conversation. Maybe mom's not doing so well, and son number one wants to keep the rental property, but son number two wants nothing to do with it, wants to sell it. Well, classic real estate planning dilemma is you cannot chop it in half, right? But if you 1031 exchanged into mineral rights, so assuming that rental property is 1031 compatible, you now defer the capital gains on that rental property. You now have a cash flowing or imminently cash flowing property in the Permian Basin if you got it from me. So you can think of that as, now instead of having a rental with tenants, toilets, and trash and property taxes, you now have
toilets, trash. I love that. The triple T. Wow.
Yeah. But I could go on a caveat there. I'll circle back in a minute.
That's okay.
But essentially for this estate planning story, it was now instead of getting checks from a landlord, now you're getting checks in direct pay, directly from the Exxons and Chevrons of the world. In this case, it was Exxon. And now they can, when the time comes, and it's time for her heirs to receive inheritance, their heirs, one, get a step up in basis, kind of going back to that swap till you drop tactic that I had briefly mentioned earlier. So the tax that mom deferred on that rental property now doesn't have to be realized by her heirs, in this case her sons. And then if son number one wants to keep his half, or he could have been willed an unequal piece, and that's okay too. But he doesn't. If he wants to retain his half, great. If son number two wants to sell all or part of the mineral rights that he inherited of that property, great. Son number one is unimpacted regardless of his decision. So that's what makes it a very powerful estate planning tool in that regard. The issues were familiarity, like we mentioned before. They had never owned minerals before. They had no familiarity with the oil and gas commodities market before. So that takes hand holding, and that's probably the biggest part of my job, unofficially speaking, right? I mean, technically, yes, I'm in the real estate buying and selling game, if you will, in the mineral rights asset class. But the reality is that is what I have to do on a daily basis, is do the hand holding, do the education, and just be readily available for when those questions arise. Because there are no dumb questions in this space. Do not try to logic your way through it. Do not apply only common sense. Just like when we talked about like kind, common sense might tell you mineral rights are not considered like kind, but your common sense will fail you because the Internal Revenue Code says you can. So that's why I say please ask any questions up front, and as you get them. Do not feel embarrassed to ask me questions that you think might be remedial. It's best to just rip the Band-Aid off, so to speak, get the information directly from the source. And, if the rare instance that I don't have the answer, I know somebody who does. I can guarantee you that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't even think about it too, that it gives that family a bit more flexibility and perhaps even just peace of mind, that
Yes.
and her children are not fighting with each other about what they're going to do, and provides them also the option to swap till we drop. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep. And it's just nice because now also she's not giving her son or sons a part-time job either to be the landlord. I mean,
Oh,
you're the landlord in a metaphorical sense, right? You own the property, and people are operating above it to extract the minerals that you
yep.
have. But you'll in the mineral deed asset class, you never get a cash call. You have no insurance requirements, no
Yeah.
maintenance requirements. It's the most passive form of real estate to my awareness, and I'd be happy to be challenged on that. You essentially just get it. You're in direct paid, like I mentioned earlier, from whoever the operator is. Again, the operator is an industry term for just who's drilling on your property. So they pay
Yeah.
you directly once a month, and it's really that simple.
Yeah, I have at any one time at least one listing that is someone who called me and is like, and right now it's my dad, built this property to run his machine shop. And, then, he didn't want to run the machine shop. He retired and he rented it out to such and such. And this person's lease is expiring. I don't want to fill it back up again. And, now I'm going to, sell, now I want to sell the property because I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to deal with, if the roof fails again. And, even if you're on a triple net, you still have to like deal with these things and pass it
Right.
on to the tenant. And sometimes in these smaller situations, I don't. So, I can relate to that. And,
Yeah,
I see this situation at least, regularly throughout each year. So,
I get it. I see it all the time as well. I'd say my most common residential client are landlords with multiple properties that are just they're over it. They want it. They're either not completely done with it, but they want to downsize the number of properties. We actually have a broker. I'm located in Dallas, Texas.
yeah.
So for anyone curious about where Southlake, Texas is, it's a suburb of Fort Worth. We had a broker, real estate commercial. Sorry, excuse me, a residential broker
Yeah.
based out of Southlake, and he had about 18 or 19 rental properties, and he's about 65-ish
Right.
years old, and very sharp, but also he wants to relax a little bit more than he is. So he's he 1031 to about 5 or 6 of those properties out into mineral properties.
Yeah.
And it's just, again, it came back to that triple T we mentioned. These like tired of the tenants, the toilets, the trash, the delinquent rents, the vacancies, the turnovers, the property tax hiking.
Oh yeah. Property
Uh,
insurance.
it's property insurance,
Yeah.
maintenance. I mean, you name it. And not to mention the returns were in our cases in the Permian Basin higher than the rents he was getting in the first place. So he's getting higher returns without the overhead.
Right.
So for him, it was a no-brainer for his scenario.
Yeah. And of course, each situation is unique, and
That's right.
disclaimer, you got to consult with people. But yeah, I would agree with that. I think having rental properties is kind of like having a puppy, like a bunch of puppies, especially if you're self-managing them.
Yeah.
Just imagine trying to take a vacation and then you're on vacation and something goes wrong and then your plumber's not coming and it's just a shitty situation. No pun
It
intended.
really is. It really can be. Unfortunately, in a literal sense sometimes.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. But yeah, this has been great. I think
Yeah.
I thought we got to talk a lot about 1031s as well as mineral rights. And is there anything that you feel like we weren't able to touch on? But I know we're going to give your information for people to reach out to directly. Is there anything you want to chat more about in the podcast today?
Yeah, I mean, for your agents and brokers in your that listen to your show,
Yeah.
the way we scale is just like traditional real estate. We if you're an agent or a broker, we compensate on a referral deal flow. So if you have an appetite for learning more about the asset class, happy to teach for free. If you have a client that has a similar appetite, or if you have a client that knows they're interested, I just require an introduction, and then I can pick up the football from there. And you're obviously more than welcome to join any and all subsequent calls we have with your folks. So.
Yeah. We have a lot of agents and brokers that listen, and then we may have sometimes entrepreneurs or investors that may or may not have one, but they can just reach out to you directly, or if they have someone, have them reach out to you. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that's my number one referral source are brokers and agents. I do work alongside from a deal flow perspective with family offices, fund managers, estate planners, like we mentioned,
Oh yeah.
business brokers to a smaller degree, but they occasionally have an appetite for this as well. But yeah, happy to chat with any and all of your listeners. Like I said, I'm an educator before sales, so happy to have a chat.
No, this has been great. So, what is the best way for someone to reach out to you?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll just old school. I'll give you my email and a contact phone number that I can receive texts, calls, or I guess you could FaceTime if you really wanted to. My direct line is 214-998-8198. And then my email is mgmt, short for management.
Yep.
At keyrealestateconsulting.com. And then obviously websites paired to that email, keyrealestateconsulting.com. That's the best way to get in contact with me. My primary source at the moment for putting on educational content is currently LinkedIn. You can find me on there as well. You can search Thomas Brachey. Went full legal for you guys there on my name. But those are the best mediums to get a hold of me and to learn more.
Oh, this has been great. Yeah, I loved it. And we made it happen. So taking it from the rooms online, chit-chatting at night, to now on the show so everyone can get to learn. So this has been great.
There you go.
So, well, I want to thank you, my listeners, for listening to another episode of the Performance Mindset Show. If today's episode gave you something to think about, be sure to share it and subscribe so you don't miss out on what's next. Want to go deeper? Grab my book, From Perfect to Real. It's all about dropping perfection and thriving your way. You can also connect with me at beyondcommercial.com or amycalandrino.com. Until next time, stay grounded, stay growing, and keep showing up for you. This is Amy Calandrino signing off.